My name's Shane. I'm an emergency physician and paediatric intensivist at Gold Coast University Hospital, and I'm a clinician researcher. And my key interest in research is really looking at topics at the pointy end of the illness. So looking at those really sick kids and where we can make a difference in their care. It's exciting and it's fun. And two of my research babies have completed recruitment this year. So I've learnt a few things along the way on how we can do research in what is a really stressful time. And I guess we first have to think about, why is that important? Why do we need to do research during a resuscitation? We've got lots of things that we could be concentrating on while we're resuscitating a child. Why is research our priority right at that point in time? And I guess my interest in it is that I find those patients really challenging and I find them really exciting. And I think that where we could make a very small difference or a very small change in their management, we might make big differences to their longer illness journey and their long-term outcomes. So if we can make a very small difference in those first hours of care, there's a potential that we will dramatically improve their longer-term outcomes. And I think secondly, we also need to think about the evidence that guides our care during resuscitation. Most of it is based on historical practice, that's the way it's always been done, or it's based on expert opinion and consensus opinion. And that's great, because that's the evidence that we've got. But where there's new interventions or new modalities of treatments or new drugs that come onto the market, it creates some low-hanging fruit to make some what should be relatively simple research projects. And I say what should be relatively simple research projects is that they're never simple. And I'm amazed at how often I find myself thinking, why on earth is this so hard? We're not asking very much. Why is it so hard to do these research projects? And that's a huge topic to talk about, and I could talk about that for a very long time. But I wanted to just touch on a few things that are the bigger topics that we think about during research, during resus, and then talk about some things that have made that a little bit easier during my research journey. And the first thing I wanted to talk about is a really tricky one. It's tricky for researchers, and it's tricky for clinicians, and it's tricky for families and their children. And that's consent during this time. So we can all picture the resus room where we're actively resuscitating a child who's come into our emergency department, and the family is there with us, experiencing that event. They're understandably shocked and distraught. They're standing in the corner of the room, rocking slightly, and thinking this can't be happening. And that clearly is not the time to wander over to them and ask them if you could have a little bit of a chat about a research project that we have going on in the department. First of all, they're not going to understand a word you've got to say. They're not going to remember anything that you say. And even if they do give consent, there's no chance that that is an informed consent, because they can't possibly process the information that you're giving them. So more and more we're moving to a model of a waiver of consent for research during resuscitation. And that's guided by a whole lot of principles that the National Health and Medical Research Council have given us to work out what research can be ethically performed without prior consent. And that uses lots of names. It uses things like deferred consent or delayed consent or consent to continue or opt-out consent. And it's confusing. It's confusing for everyone. Really, we should be using the words waiver of consent rather than deferred or delayed consent, because you can't consent to something that's already happened. So we really are using a waiver of consent, and we need to talk about it in those terms. Through the PREDICT network and also through the ICU research networks, we've done some very large studies involving critically ill children using this model of consent, so consent to continue mainly. And it's really well accepted by both clinicians and the families of these children. So of the thousands of children that we've recruited to some of these studies, we've got a retention rate of more than 95%. In that 95% of the families that we approach a couple of days down the track agree to continue in that study. And more reassuringly, they're not upset that we didn't ask them in the first place. They're completely fine that we've made that decision and we've given them a treatment, and they're happy to continue to contribute to that study. So in our jurisdiction, a waiver of consent model is really well accepted. Now that's not the same everywhere over the world, and there will be cultural differences and there's legal differences throughout different jurisdictions as well. But at least for now, in our context, it's reasonably well accepted. The next big thing we need to think about when we're trying to do research during a resuscitation is the cognitive load on the clinicians in the room. And that's not just the team leader who's running the resus, it's everyone in the room. We are all stressed when we're looking after a really sick child. And there is this perception that adding research to that is only going to worsen that cognitive load. So we need to be really aware of what we're asking people to do in the moment. We also need to recognise that whenever we disrupt the status quo, it makes us feel uncomfortable. So if we're proposing that you're going to change a treatment that you've done for your entire career to do something completely new, people are going to feel uncomfortable doing that. So we need to make sure that we've brought people along the research journey so they understand why the question is important and why potentially your practice might need to change. So there needs to be a shared understanding of the question that we're trying to answer. Some of that reduction of cognitive load comes through the research design, which I'll talk about a little bit more. And a lot of it comes through making people think along the same lines as how you came to your research question. So we need to make sure that we have our clinicians on board with the study, otherwise you're really not going to get anyone recruiting. And along the same lines of the cognitive load, we need to think really clearly about what data we need to collect as part of a research project. We can all come up with some gold standard score that will tell us whether their treatment's successful, that is 4 pages long and on an A3 piece of paper. The chances of us getting that data is almost zero. So we need to be really pragmatic about what data we're going to collect to reduce the cognitive load on those clinicians in the resus room. And we also need to think about alternative ways that we might be able to collect that data. If we're thinking about the roles that we allocate as we're preparing for a resus to come in, allocating someone to collect data for research is not on that list. I might think it should be, but it's definitely not on that list, and it's almost certainly the first thing that's going to get dropped off when there's not enough people. So we need to think about how else we could collect that data that's hands-off and reliable. Some of you will have been involved with some projects that have used video as a data collection tool recently. So a few projects through the PREDICT network, the CONCEPT study, which looked at anticonvulsants in convulsive status epilepticus, and Kids Thrive, which looked at intubation, apneic oxygen during intubation, have both used video as a data collection tool. And they've been really successful in doing that, in that we've managed to collect video data for the large proportion of the patients enrolled in the study. And I'm not going to say that was easy to implement either, but once the video became part of our practice, it was really well accepted by staff and families. In Kids Thrive, we had nearly 1,000 intubations. We've got over 900 videos of intubations. We found during the study that people actually got used to the video being there and would actually talk to the video and tell us what happened during the intubation. They'll say, "Oh, you might not have seen this, but that tube didn't go in the right hole." And we just kind of adjusted it, but someone was standing in front of it, so you might not have seen it. Or the SATs went down to 91, but they probably were on their way down quicker. They give us all of this extra information that we were never anticipating capturing. And it gave us a really reliable tool to validate the information that was on the piece of paper, so that we can say the results we're reporting are accurate and verifiable. So there are a few of the challenges that we need to think about when we're designing research, but what actually makes it work? We've talked about the research design, but really there's 3 other key factors which all kind of overlap a little bit on what makes research work, particularly in critical illness. We need people that allow research to happen, and that's not just your energetic PhD candidate or your research nurse who works on Mondays every second week. It's the entire team. It's the director that supports research in the department. It's the executive director that pays for research in the department and doesn't try and pull them back to clinical duties when the next mini disaster happens. It's having research nurses that are integrated into the team of the department, who have their face known and are trusted members of the team. And it's having people feel like they're part of the research team, even if they're not leading a research project. And that feeds into the culture of a department. It's really important that research is something that a department does, not something that is done in a department. So changing that mindset into research is something we do, not something that's done, is really powerful. It makes people feel involved in the question and more involved in implementing the answer. And we can achieve some of that through practice. We simulate everything. In our departments, we all are doing constant simulations about medical practice. We need to incorporate research into our simulations to make it part of our core business and allow that opportunistic education to make sure research is on the agenda. I've been fortunate enough to work with some very clever people who've done some very clever trials, and I've learnt a few things over my relatively short research career. And I think one of the most valuable lessons I've learnt is that nobody loves your research project like you do. It's your baby. It's perfect. You want to make it grow. It can do no wrong. It's the ideal project with the ideal outcome. Not everyone thinks that way of their babies. And it's really important that you're able to see that it's not this panacea of research that's going to solve the world's woes. And that when you start describing it to other people, they're going to look at it and go, what on earth are they talking about? Like, that just sounds terrible. And you need to be prepared for people to have that reaction and to take their feedback on, because they're going to end up being the ones that do the hard work for your research project. It may be that your baby isn't perfect and you actually need to do some significant changes. Whatever you've proposed might not be at all practical in the real world or outside of your department. So you need to be very flexible and adapt your approach, make changes to the protocol and make it more practical for the real world. And another key lesson I've learnt is about building that research culture. I work in a big department. We have pods in our department, and at the beginning of each shift we have a huddle for all of the staff that are working in that pod for the day. We invite anyone who's working in the pod, doctors, nurses, allied health, cleaners, wardies, research staff, anyone who's there. I can't remember the last day I worked that I didn't meet someone new. And it's a really valuable 5 minutes of our day so that we can meet each other and understand what our role is and how we are going to contribute to the shift today. In many of these huddles, we do what we call a mini mental model rehearsal, where we have a case that we talk about. About 20% of our paediatric resuscitations walk through the door, so we have zero preparation time. So we use these mini mental model rehearsals as a chance for us to practice what we might do if something walks through the door, where we allocate our roles and we know what each of the team member can contribute to that patient's care. In the last 12 months or so, we've introduced research into some of those as well. We go, well, this patient might be eligible for Feisty Junior. How would we go about doing that? So that there's a chance to talk about research, introduce the research nurse, and they've got a face that they can call to say, I don't know anything about this study, but I think they might be eligible. Can you come and help me? And it's really changed the way we think about research, and that everyone kind of feels like they're comfortable to ask questions and get involved in the various research projects we have going on. And I think one of the other things that I've learnt is that we really need to use the technology that we have around us. We're lucky enough to work in a very rich health system. We have a lot of resources at our disposal. We have simulation in many of our resus rooms with these high-tech video cameras that can get video from multiple angles and include patient monitors and get high quality audio. Yet we don't use them for research. We only use them for simulation. So why can't we use those technologies to help us answer some research questions? We also have increasingly complex patient monitoring systems that collect huge amounts of data and often store it for a very long time. Can we use those technologies to export into our research projects? Even if we don't have high-tech video equipment, can we use simpler technologies like iPads and GoPros that have a one-button start option to record things when we need to, and use that as a data collection tool? And I'm sure there's many other technological advances that we could embrace in our health systems, including our electronic health records. So it's worthwhile pushing the boundaries of technology to use it for things that we haven't used it for before, and that can only help our research efforts. Research in resuscitation is possible. I don't mean to dissuade people from trying. There are a lot of challenges, and you will hear that what you're trying to do is impossible. We've all heard it, I think, across the panel here many times, that that's not going to work. Everything is possible. There is a way to work it out, so don't give up. And research is most certainly a team sport, so reach out for help, and we can work together to improve the care of our sickest patients. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Shane. Again, any questions from the floor will be gratefully accepted. I think one of the things that's interesting to reflect on is that, you know, in our day-to-day work, there's probably a very small proportion of what we do is actually truly evidence-based, and resuscitation is one of those areas where you're just doing what APLS teaches you, which is mostly based on no evidence, or what you did last time, or what you saw someone do. And, you know, are we at the point where we can get resuscitation rooms videoed all the time, every time, in every setting, as a way to improve quality and measure what we do, but also to then think about how you run trials? How do you think you go getting that through an ethics committee?
I think it's easier than it was a few years ago. A lot of hospitals now have a blanket approval to video patient care episodes. So it kind of depends on what you're trying to use it for. If you're using it to improve the quality of care that we deliver, I don't think there's an ethical problem with it. I think if you're trying to target personal performance, I think you'll have more of a problem. But if we're using it as a quality improvement tool, I think the ethics committees are largely on board with that now.
Yes, there's a question down here.
Thanks for the talk, Shane. Following on from that answer from yourself and Simon, do you foresee a point in the future where education sessions are purely, I guess, like we see in the football, the sporting world, where people have tape sessions and sit down as a department or sit down as a team and watch their match analysis from the weekend?
I think that's a really interesting question. I think so. I think there's a role for actively looking at your past performance. I don't know that we're necessarily ready for that. But I think as we become more comfortable, it's kind of like when we first started doing simulation. Everyone hated watching themselves during the debrief. And that kind of feeling, while it's still there, it's not as petrifying as it was once upon a time. And I think we'll get there with that personal review of individual cases. And I think that's probably somewhere where M&M style meetings can probably go in the future.
I think that's a really interesting place to go. I suppose the difference between simulation is that nothing ever really bad happens and it's a safe educational space. If you're doing that same context in something where something's gone wrong and you are feeling to blame and that everyone else can see what you've done or not done, I think that will be an extra stretch, and so it'd have to be done so carefully. And again, when would you turn the camera on? When would you turn the camera off? Do you need it running 24/7? Because resuscitations aren't planned; they happen when they happen. And so having a system where you're either recording footage 24/7 in every resuscitation room and then using bits for studies, and there's a whole lot of unapproved or non-research footage in there. It's a potentially really interesting area, but it's fraught and it's a very challenging place. But I think Shane's point that it is possible, all these things are possible. Think about what are the gaps in resuscitation care, or what are the things that we are wondering about. It doesn't all have to be, you can measure now the depth of CPR that you're doing if you put the right pads on things. So there's all sorts of technological ways of looking at some very interesting parts of how we do what we do. Any other questions? Sorry, the light's a bit bright. I think we're done. Thanks very much, Shane.
Thank you.